So a little bit of business from our last class. We didn't quite take up this argument, so I propose to do that right off the hop, and then we'll get into some new stuff, yeah? Okay, so this was a little tricky because of one little bit of oddness. So there's at least two things that we should talk about here. So pets are good for your health, so you should get a dog. Having a dog decreases stress, and walking a dog daily keeps you exercising, and dogs are so cute. Okay, so this was in the arguments with missing premises bit. So we're looking for missing premises, and I was particularly emphasizing normative missing premises. So the conclusion, I think we could say, is you should get a dog, and that's a normative premise. It's a premise, it's a conclusion about what you should do, and these premises seem to be mostly descriptive. We'll talk about this normative descriptive thing at length today, so that's our main subject. But I was looking for missing premises that would connect those things up, the descriptions with the conclusion about what you should do. But there's another little weird wrinkle here, which is that the first sentence starts with pets are good for your health, and then the conclusion is about dogs. So there's two things that we could do about this. So it seems like there's a little bit of disconnect between some of the premises and the conclusion. So, for example, having a dog decreases stress and walking a dog daily keeps you exercising. Those both seem to be good reasons to believe that getting a dog is good for your health. But that's not exactly the same as saying getting a pet is good for your health. So we could take two different strategies here. Here's one way of breaking it down. So let's just go through and map the premises as such. And all I've done here is say, replace in premise one, pets are good for your health, with dogs are good for your health. So I've rephrased this. I've changed the meaning a little. And you might have to do a little bit of that, because in reading this, I think it's reasonable to say that the author didn't intend to mean that literally any pet whatsoever is good for your health. If you have a pet jaguar, it might eat you, and that's bad for your health. Or if you have a pet goldfish, that's not really going to increase your health that much. Maybe a little, but it seems to be the argument is focused on showing that dogs are good for your health. And so by just rephrasing that one premise, it makes it a lot easier to map, a lot easier to see how things fit together. So in some senses, you help the author, help make explicit what the author is about by doing that kind of stuff. Sorry, yeah?
But what if we know, in the situation that, we're not supposed to do that? What if instead, within the missing premise, you included something about pets to link?
Yeah, okay, good. So I think you're jumping to the second strategy that we'll talk about. So I think that's also a very valid way of dealing with this. Yeah. Did you have another question up here? Same basic idea. Okay, so let's deal with this first strategy first, see how it goes. So you're gonna have to rephrase premises. Sometimes you're gonna have to rephrase them in ways like this to make the kind of flow of the argument make sense. I think this is a much easier argument to defend because now everything kind of connects up. So we'll talk later about what's called the principle of charity, which is reading arguments in the ways that sort of make them make the most sense. You might have to do some slight adjustments to make it make more sense to yourself, make it clear how everything fits together. We'll talk about, in just a minute, a second strategy we can use here to just read this in a very literal way, and not adjust the given premises, but just add missing premises to connect them up. Okay, so let's try mapping it as is. So we get the conclusion at the bottom, of course, and I think that there are probably two missing premises here. One, that you should take care of your health, and two, that you should surround yourself with cuteness. Both of those are true. And they kind of correspond to two broad chunks of this argument, right? So we've got P4, dogs are cute. Let's say that goes directly to the conclusion in combination with MP2. So dogs are cute, you should surround yourself with cuteness, therefore you should get a dog. Does that make sense as a kind of independent argument here? Okay. And then there's this stuff about health. I take it that health and the enjoying of cute things are sort of separate. Like suppose you don't really care about your health. Suppose you're 94 and you're like, I'm on the way out anyway. I'm not really eating a lot of health food, who cares? But you should still surround yourself with cute things. You should still enjoy your life, even if you're not worried too much about your health. Similarly, suppose you don't think dogs are cute, you might nonetheless be convinced by this argument from them making you healthy. So these are two independent lines of reasoning. So here, because I've adjusted it from pets to dogs, so we could say something like P1, dogs are good for your health, and you should do things that make you more healthy, P1 and MP1 in a dependent relationship. And then P2 and P3 are just reasons to believe P1. 2 independent reasons for P1. Yeah? Does that make sense to you? Is that okay? Okay. So, but suppose that we hadn't adjusted P1. Suppose we want to read this very literally, and we don't want to like take any licenses with it. We might add a missing premise here, call it missing premise 3, which says something like dogs are pets, or dogs are a type of pet, or something like that. So now instead of P1, suppose that says pets are good for your health. We might say, we might add MP3 to this relation. So, sorry, we'll make MP3 here, and suppose we need P1 as well. So, pets are good for your health. Dogs are a type of pet. You should do things that are good for your health. Yeah? So if something's a dog, then it's a pet. If something's a pet, then it's good for your health. You should do things that are good for your health, so you should get a dog. Does that all kind of connect up? Yeah.
Would you have to change the arrows from P2 and P3 to P1 then?
Sorry, yes, I would. Now instead of leading to this, they would lead to, yeah, they would still lead to P1. Yeah, that's right. Now, does that make sense? So 2 ways of approaching this, 2 ways of sort of making this thing fit together and flow. One of them is just slightly rephrase the premise, and another is adding in a missing premise. And I don't think I have a good reason why one of those is just obviously the better approach. Either one of those ways of reconstructing the argument, I hope, kind of gets the meaning of the argument, it gets how it hangs together, it gets how the evidence is supposed to flow through the argument, that sort of thing. So you'll have a bunch of choices, especially with more complex arguments, you'll have a bunch of choices like this to make. Do I change the way the premise is phrased, or do I add a missing premise to make the way it is phrased connect up to the conclusion? These are just sort of choices you get to make when you're analyzing arguments, so long as you preserve the basic logical structure. I take it the basic logical structure is there's 2 main sub-arguments, one about cuteness, one about health, and then there's 2 layers to the health one about specific ways in which dogs are good for you, and one about the general fact that dogs are good for your health. So if you've captured all that, you've got all of the sort of large-scale structure of the argument, and there's going to often be small-scale details that you can play with and change, and there's just going to be more than one right answer about that kind of stuff. So, yeah? Is that all right? Any questions about that one? Okay. Are you comfortable with the idea that there's going to be more than one answer to these style of questions, I guess is the, yeah.
Could we hypothetically, for missing premises,
Yeah.
could we say that, for example, to premise 1, dogs, or premise 2, having a dog decreases stress, being less stressed is good for your health?
Good.
Having a dog keeps you exercising, exercise is good for your health?
Yeah, so here's another, very good. Those are further choices that we might make. There's a kind of, so we could talk about the kind of degree of resolution that you want on your argument. How deeply do you want to analyze it? And you can analyze it down to the point where every single connection is deductively valid. So if I say something like, just like what you just said, so having a dog decreases stress, decreased stress is good for your health, therefore dogs are good for your health. Now we've got it in a purely it's a valid argument or a valid sub-argument. So by adding missing premises, the connection between the premises becomes much stronger. But of course, at the expense of having added in a missing premise, then you've got another part of the argument that sort of needs to be argued for or justified, or the truth of the premises. So you're trading off the logical strength of the argument for adding in more premises that might turn out to be false. So there's a kind of trade-off that you can do there by mapping it more and more deeply, more and more carefully. And again, there's just not going to be one single right answer for how deeply do you need to analyze these arguments, how much can you let remain intuitive. So if you say, having a dog decreases stress, I take it that nobody was confused about the relationship between stress and health, right? We all get that there's a pretty straightforward correlation, and that's the conditions under which it makes sense to leave a premise missing. But you might not want to let anything be missing. You might want to make everything explicit. So the question is, how fine a resolution do you want to have on your argument? And you can have a very rough one or a very, very fine one. And it's sort of up to your purposes where you need it to be. For the purposes of tests, I will make sure that it's fairly clear where you're aiming. But yeah. Okay? Okay. Good. So now we're getting into some of the flexibility in this technique, right? The different ways you can use it. And it's just sort of a multi-purpose tool. And for some purposes, you want maximum resolution and all of the detail you can possibly get. For other purposes, if nobody is going to be confused or concerned about the relationship between, for example, stress and health, you can maybe leave that implicit. You can just sort of leave this connection. I can see how P2 and P1 are supposed to be related. Yeah. Okay? Okay, good. Okay, so for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to get deeper into this notion of normativity. This is going to be an odd lecture. It's going to have more philosophy than usual. But I think it's important to get a little bit of this framework on the table, to get a little bit of sort of conceptual machinery available to you so you can think critically about this stuff. Now, I'm not going to test you on almost all of this. So I'm going to present to you a bunch of ethical theories, and I'm really not going to ask you questions about them on the test because I don't have time to extensively explain all these things. My goal here is really to give you a flavor of the various ways of thinking about normativity that are available, to give you a little bit of framework, and so that you can sort of find yourself in this picture of various pictures of ethics, have a very clear picture of what ethics is supposed to be about and normativity is supposed to be about and all that stuff. So I'll put on, so for the purposes of, I don't mean to hyper-focus on the test, but for the purposes of the test, what I'm going to do is give you a list of key course terms, ideas that are important, ideas that I consider testable. So there'll be a short list of central terms from this lecture, from all of the lectures that you can use for study and review. So if this feels like it's going a bit too fast to take it all in, please don't panic. I'm really just trying to give you a very quick overview. So this is like, there are entire courses on ethics. Actually, people spend their entire lives studying ethics. I'm going to try to do it in an hour and a half or so. So this is going to be a whirlwind tour of the world of ethics and how it relates to arguments. Okay? Okay. I think normativity is one of the most important things that we can think about when we're critically reasoning, precisely because when the arguments that matter are the arguments about what we should do or what we ought to do, right? Ultimately, what we care about is how we should behave, how we should live our lives. So the really important arguments are going to be arguments with some normative component to them. And it's tough to deal with. So we'll see. It's kind of complicated to deal with normativity. It is not a simple subject, even though it's something so transparent that we barely think about it when we're dealing with it. So we talked about missing premises last time. This is a non-normative missing premise. This is just a descriptive premise. We also saw this example of normative missing premises. So I fixed up my misunderstanding of how electric fences work here. Now I'm just concerned that maybe you'll wreck the fence. But remember this argument about not touching the electric fence, and we sort of explored the ways in which somebody's values might influence the way this argument hits them, right? So if you say it's going to be painful for you, the assumption was that people don't want to feel pain, or that we have some priorities that like avoiding pain is high up on our list of priorities. Now, not everybody has that as a priority. Not everybody cares that much about avoiding physical pain. So part of the argument, of course, is this hidden assumption that that's what you care about. Or in this reconstruction, say you might wreck the fence. Part of the argument is that you care about wrecking the fence or running up the electrical bill or whatever it is. So those normative premises very often play a role in our arguments. They very often play an implicit role in our arguments because it's so transparent to you that, of course, you don't want to feel pain, right? It's so obvious that it's not worth saying. And that's kind of it's not that all normative premises will be missing. So please note, not all normative premises are missing premises. Not all missing premises are normative. So just to get this very clear, I'm not saying that we never say our values. I'm not saying we never say what you should or ought to do. Those are often explicitly given in arguments. And it's not the case that all missing premises are normative. We saw in this first example, so this is a non-normative missing premise. It's just a descriptive fact that we needed to connect. We saw in this argument about dogs, it was clear that we could have added missing premises to P2 and P3, which were descriptive. So walking a dog lowers your stress, lowered stress increases health, therefore walking a dog increases health. So those would also be descriptive missing premises. But it's very often the case that we don't say our values out loud on the assumption that everybody's going to agree with our values. And that assumption is usually a good one. Usually it's the case that people's values align. That's how we sort of get together. That's how societies work. They sort of smoothly operate because almost everybody's operating on the same values almost all the time. But of course, it's not always the case that we agree on our values. And some of the most tricky arguments to navigate are those with these normative premises in it. So sometimes people do disagree on our values, and it's hard to argue about these things without at least some ethical framework to deal with. So today, we're going to be dealing with, so suppose somebody was going to deny MP1 or MP2. Suppose you've got somebody who says, I don't care about wrecking the fence, why should I? What would you say to somebody like that? You've hurt their feelings. You say, or they've hurt your feelings. You say, you hurt my feelings. And they say, so? Who cares about that? What do you say to somebody like that? How could you possibly formulate an argument that would be convincing to them that they should care about that? And these are questions about how you would justify MP1 or MP2. So what premises could you add that lead to MP1 or MP2, these value statements? They don't just come out of thin air. They don't just come out of nowhere. They can sometimes have very good reasons why those things are valuable. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the sort of level of ethical theories which can justify normative claims. That's the idea, okay? Okay, so just take a step back, talk about this normative descriptive thing. I've been using this language. I hope I explained it a little bit, but just to review, so we've got descriptive claims like the apple is red. Now there's facts of the matter about whether the apple's red, right? You can put it under a color scanner. You can take a picture of it and measure the color values. If two people disagree, there's sort of scientific instruments that you could bring to bear on whether the apple is in fact red or not. The apple is good. This apple is good. How do you test that? If two people disagreed about it, one person takes a bite of the apple and say, it's good. And another takes a bite and says, this is terrible. So that's a normative claim. It's a claim about what's good or bad. You might say, you should eat this apple because it's good. Yeah? And the question is, how do we evaluate claims like that? Just to give a couple of examples of the kind of things that are normative and descriptive language. You should wash your hands versus you didn't wash your hands. One is a fact and one is a value claim. You ought to take your time there versus you were faster than yesterday. Here's one that sounds objective. So here's a claim that I hope everybody agrees on. Murder is wrong. Yeah, we're all down with murder being a bad thing. But that's a normative claim. It's a claim about values, what we ought to do, what we should do, how we should behave, versus the murder rate is down. Charity is a virtue. It's another a clearly normative language versus charitable donations are up. It's bad to litter. Here's one. Usury is a sin. Usury is, by the way, the charging of interest for loans, which is technically forbidden by, I think, all three of the major Abrahamic religions. Whereas OSAP charges interest is just the fact of the matter, right? That's just the reality of the situation. Okay, so normative language, be on the alert for clearly normative language when we're talking about something being a virtue or something being wrong or right, bad or good, ought or should, sin, or what's the opposite of a sin? Virtue, I guess. Yeah. So these are the kind of words that clearly indicate normative language. I wish I could give you a definition of normativity that doesn't involve normative language. It's really hard to get linguistically underneath this stuff. I take it that you all, when I put up a list like this, you all get the distinction I'm getting at because you've been exposed to normative concepts since before you could talk, right? People have been telling you what you should or shouldn't do your entire life. And you've probably had opinions about what people should or shouldn't do equally as long. So this is just sort of a completely ubiquitous fact of human life that we've got these value claims. We've got this language that clearly indicates it. But anytime I try to explain normativity, I find myself talking in circles. I just give a bunch of synonyms that sort of all lead around to each other. What is it that's bad? It's what you shouldn't do. What does it mean that you shouldn't do it? It's bad. That's as good as I can get, really, without kind of getting into what I'm going to get into today, which is ethical theory. Okay. So, now, there's nothing in philosophy that's not controversial, but here's a thing that a lot of people agree with, and for the purposes of this class, I'm going to ask us to all follow this as though it was clearly and unambiguously true. Call it Hume's law. So David Hume famously said this: you can't derive an ought from an is. That is to say, if you've got just descriptive premises, you can't get a normative conclusion. So take murder is wrong. You say, okay, what purely descriptive facts would you use to try to prove that murder is wrong? You'd say, well, people suffer. And then somebody says, okay, well, why is suffering wrong? Yes, they're having stress hormones and their water is falling out of their eyes and they make unpleasant noises, but like, why is that wrong? So to get to according to Hume, to get to a normative conclusion, you always need a normative premise in there somewhere. Yeah? Just stating the facts of the matter never gets you to that you should or shouldn't do something in particular. Right? So there's some debate about this, but let's take it as read. So when we're building argument diagrams, anytime you've got a normative conclusion or subconclusion, you need a normative premise in there somewhere. If it's not there, you write it in as a missing premise. I will ask you to be a little more strict about that than non-normative missing premises. So for example, in this, decreased stress is good for your health. That's a non-normative missing premise. You might reasonably leave that as just sort of understood. But because normativity is so important to the most important arguments in our lives, I'm going to be sort of strict about this, that anytime you see a normative conclusion, there's got to be a normative premise in there somewhere. Now, of course, not all normative premises are missing. It could be explicitly given in the argument, so you don't have to add one in, but it's got to be in there somewhere. Yeah? Okay. So consider the following inferences. Your hands are dirty, therefore you should wash your hands. That's not a good argument for us. So given that we're going to all be following Hume's law for the rest of this course, this is an insufficient argument. You need something like, and it's good to be clean. Right? To get that should, to get this directive that you ought to be washing your hands, you need some belief about the value or the worthiness of being clean. Yeah? Okay. Astronomy can teach us new facts about the universe. Therefore, we should fund astronomy research. Because again, it's a normative conclusion with just a descriptive premise. There's just, yeah, true. It's true that astronomy can teach us new facts about the universe, but you run the simulation in your head. Imagine somebody doesn't care about that at all. Maybe they think we have enough facts about the universe, thank you. They're not really willing to spend money on that. So we need something like, and knowledge is good. Something like that. Yeah? Okay, so these are the kind of gaps in the argument that we're hopefully going to become sensitized to. What I'd like to present to you is a 4-level model of this stuff. So there are people in the world, smart people, who've thought really hard about this, that think that basically our values are kind of, we might say, purely subjective, that there's no good arguments for values claims. So if I say something like, and it's good to be clean, what I'm doing there is essentially just expressing my preferences. I'm saying, hooray for cleanness. I'm not saying something that could be rationally justified. So there's no rational, so these people are people who believe that there's no rational justification for values claims. You got your values, I got mine. You know, just like I like certain foods and you like other foods. There's no argument for why you should like the foods I like. People sometimes believe that things like being clean is good or murder is wrong are just like preferences for certain dishes of food. You might call them sort of moral anti-realists or something like that. So when we're thinking about this stuff, I think, so these are people who believe that there are no good ethical theories. So an ethical theory is supposed to justify values claims. That's what the job of an ethical theory is. So there really are very smart people who have thought really hard about this that think that there are no justifiable ethical theories. We call them error theorists about morality. They think that that's just all a hopeless project. So you might be one of these people. You might think ethics is all just made up or something like that. I think nonetheless, I'm going to try to convince you that values, goals, and of course behavior are real things that we really need to consider. So we can disagree about the status of ethical theories. I'm going to present a model to you in which we're going to build up at least to values in a way that I hope everybody should agree makes sense as a way of thinking. Yeah? Okay. Okay. So, so start from behavior. Everybody agrees that's a real thing, I hope. So consider when we're thinking about behavior, consider all of the things that you can do, literally all of them. You could twitch your right index finger. You could sing a high C note. You could blink your eyes. Or you could think a thought. So including in behavior, let's also consider mental behavior, internal behavior. So you're trying to solve a math problem. You're just sitting there, not moving, but you're doing, in this sense of behavior, you're behaving because you're thinking about it. So I'd like you to think for a second about the space of possible behaviors in this sense that are available to you. String together all of the behaviors that you could possibly think of. How many behaviors are available to you? How many combinations of behaviors? I would say that that number is vast beyond imagining. The number of behaviors available to you at any given time is so unbelievably vast that you couldn't even begin to make a dent in it by just doing stuff at random. Like, so for example, making yourself a sandwich. You want to make yourself a cucumber and cheese sandwich, and what you're going to do is just start doing behaviors at random and see if you end up with a sandwich. So I'm going to kick my right leg out a little bit. I'm going to think about pigeons. I'm going to twitch my left finger. And how soon do you think I'm going to get a sandwich? Just randomly doing behaviors. I'm going to starve to death, right? I'm never going to get a sandwich like that. I will very quickly starve to death. But before I even begin to make progress on the sandwich project, not a humongous project. It's a kind of thing that we can all manage, hopefully. Doing behavior at random is not a working strategy for any of your life projects, right? So how do we decide amongst this unimaginably vast space of behaviors which ones we're going to do? Well, we've got goals. Goals kind of narrow that space down for you. So my goal is make a sandwich. Immediately the space of possible behaviors gets collapsed way, 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 way down to some very limited set. And so we carve out this extremely fine thread through the space of possible behaviors that leads us to a cucumber sandwich. Right? So that's what your goals do for you. They kind of organize your behavior. They help you select amongst possible behaviors which ones you're interested in. And of course, you can have various size goals. So making a sandwich is a relatively small scale goal. It's of course made up of sub goals, right? So my goal first is to stand up and then walk to the kitchen. I have a goal of opening the fridge and looking inside it, assessing the contents. So you can break down this make a sandwich goal into various sub goals. Of course, you can have much larger goals than that. None of you would have made it here today if you didn't have larger scale goals than make a sandwich. So like complete a bachelor's degree is a fairly large scale goal. And that helps you pick out a whole bunch of sub goals for yourself, like choose classes, attend those classes, attempt to do well in those classes, and so on and so forth. So we've got very small scale goals, we've got larger scale goals, you can have big life goals. Live a good life, there's a goal, a very large scale goal, but it nonetheless helps you pick out some behaviors over others, right? Okay, so your behavior is the set of all possible things that you can do. Let's say your goals tell you how to behave. So given some set of goals, how should I behave? That's what they do. They sort of organize and select amongst the possible behaviors that you've got. So far, hopefully we're all on board with this. This should all be terribly uncontroversial. Okay, so then values. Values, I would propose, help us to organize our goals. So they play the same role with respect to goals as goals do with respect to behavior. So which goals should you set for yourself? If your life is going well at all, you get some choice about what your goals are. I mean, there is some point at which it's going very, very bad. Like in slavery, you don't get to choose a lot of your own goals. But like if your life is going better than that, you are deciding which goals to set for yourself to some degree, hopefully to a substantial degree. So which of my goals are worth pursuing? Which goals should I set for myself? Values in this sense are like big abstract meta goals, right? So values are usually sort of more stable than goals. Once you make the sandwich, that goal is done with, right? The goal is over. But your value of, I don't know, eating well sort of persists across goal setting events, right? So you set a bunch of goals, you kind of set them up and knock them down. Your values sort of persist across goals. They're like persistent goals that stay with you, tell you which sub-goal, which even sometimes large-scale goals are worth pursuing. So some set of values determined that for you it was worth attempting to complete a bachelor's degree, for example. Like, why did you set that as a goal? You've got some values. It's probably different for many of you. Probably a variety of values led you to set those goals. But something made that goal seem worthwhile to you. I want to get my parents off my back, or I want to get a good job, or I want to learn stuff. Maybe some combination of those. So values do the same. Of all of the goals that you could set, which ones should you set? Again, the space of possible goals is vast beyond imagining. It makes astronomical scales look tiny by comparison. So which of those goals should you pick? Well, you pick according to your values. Right? What do you care about? What do you think is important? What do you think is relevant? What do you think is worth spending the very finite time and energy that you've been given on? Right? So your values help structure your goals in just the same way that your goals structure your behavior. They're really just sort of like large-scale, persistent goals. So your values are your picture of what's important. Yeah? Now, as I said, they tell you what goals to set, but your values can compete, right? So this is something to keep in mind. This will actually have practical import for us as we're trying to map arguments. Your values don't always agree with each other in what goals they recommend. So you have the goal of being very successful in your career and also having a chill, relaxed life. And those values might recommend different goals. So values can often recommend different things. They might conflict. They might sort of be in tension with each other. So in the electric fence example, you say, pain is bad. And I agree that pain is bad. But you also might think, this might be funny. And your value of things that are funny might override your unwillingness to experience pain. So those are two conflicting values that might recommend different goals, either touching or not touching the electric fence. Yeah? So when we're talking about the relationship between a normative premise and a conclusion, that's rarely going to be a deductively tight relationship. So you have a test on Tuesday. It is important to study for tests. Therefore, you should study. And I want to insist that that is not a deductive argument, because you can accept premise one and this missing premise that it's important to study for tests, yet the conclusion could fail to follow. So suppose that on Monday night, your house burns down. It's a thing. This is a thing that happens to people. So you got a test on Tuesday, it's Monday night, your house is literally on fire. You should not be studying for that test. You should be, the importance of dealing with that literal house on fire vastly outstrips the you can accept that it's important to study for tests, but there are also more important things in life, or like a loved one is deathly ill, or you're deathly ill, or any other sort of humongous life thing that greatly outweighs the importance of studying for tests, which it is important to study for tests, but that's not the only important thing. Yeah? So when we're talking about values, we're talking about where you think you should spend your precious time and energy, what goals you think are worth setting, and of course setting a goal is committing resources. So to say something is important is to say that it's worth committing some resources to, but that always leaves open the possibility that something else is going to be more important, right? So just to say something is important is not to say that nothing else is going to be important either. So I take it that P1 and MP1 are relevant to the conclusion. It's not like these are irrelevant considerations. It's just not a deductively valid argument, yeah? Because other things might turn out to be more important depending on the circumstances. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so your values, so far we've done goals, they tell you how to behave. Values, they tell you what goals to set. Now we can think a little bit about what values you should have. So if your life is going just okay, you still get to set some of your own goals. If your life is going really well, you might get to decide some of your own values. You might actually be in a position to shape and construct a value structure for yourself. People do this. People do this all the time. It happens very slowly. It happens perhaps over the scale of generations rather than in a day or a week or a year, but it does happen. People have been shifting their values pretty consistently. And now I think this moment in history more than most other moments in history. I think most of my ancestors, most of our ancestors were farmers, and they grew up with one set of values and they died with that set of values, and there was no sort of notion on the horizon that that would be changing. So for most of history, we get values that are pretty stable. We're in a position where our values are shifting pretty fast. The question of what we should be valuing is an open question, and we have the opportunity to, because we get more education, I mean, also almost all of our ancestors were illiterate, and we presumably are all at least semi-literate. We have access to way more information, way more perspectives. Most of our ancestors never left their local area. We get the opportunity to travel and interact with other cultures. So the question of which things we should value is an open question in a way today that has rarely been in history. Not never, but this is a kind of rare moment in history where we get to think about what our values should be. And to think about that, you need an ethical theory. Basically, the job of an ethical theory is to tell you what values are worth having. Yeah? So it's such that if you find yourself in a position where you've inherited a bunch of values from your culture that you find odious, say, okay, what should I be doing about these? How should I try to reshape them? And if you believe that there are rational arguments to be made about that kind of thing, ethical theories are where to look. So, ethical theories are supposed to justify value claims. Now, as I noted at the beginning of this, not everybody agrees that there are such things, theories that can justify value claims. So this is at least a somewhat controversial position in philosophy and in the wider world. So please don't, so I hope that I've sort of set this up so that you can agree that there are behaviors and goals and values. If you disagree that there are good ethical theories, that's fine. Nothing in the rest of the course will hang on that. But I'd like to present to you some sort of ethical theories that are used to sort of formulate which values are the good ones and which values are the bad ones. And we'll see that there's quite a bit of variety in this. So there are lots of different ethical theories that come up with different answers to which values we should be cultivating in ourselves and our society and stuff like that. But there are kind of answers to the question, how do I pick? There's a medley of different answers you could choose from on the question, how should I structure my values? So that's going to be what we'll talk about next. But perhaps, right, so this is the step that we're wondering. So MP1, it's important to study for tests. Suppose somebody doubts that. Suppose somebody says, I don't know that that's true, that it's important to study for tests. The job of an ethical theory is to be like something that justifies a normative premise. It's to give justification or reasons to believe some values claim. Right. So for the rest of the lecture, basically, we're going to be talking about ethical theories that are meant to justify values claims. And I'm really just going to go over a bunch of different types of these things. There's no time to go into any detail. If you find this stuff interesting, come do a bunch of philosophy with us. You'd be very welcome. Yeah, okay. So we'll talk about the ethics of consequence. So this is a kind of brand of ethical theories, a variety of ethical theories that basically say that something is good if it's got good consequences. Therefore, ethics of consequence or consequentialism. So just to note, none of these ethical theories are on the test. So if you're furiously writing this stuff down, you're welcome to do so, but you don't need to. Okay. So a couple of types of consequentialism, a couple of types of the ethics of consequence. Here's ethical egoism. This is not a super popular theory, but so filling out the idea of like, what do you mean if it's got good consequences? And one way of filling that out is to say, well, if it's got good consequences for me, then it's good. So that's just, you're just going to evaluate whether you think some given set of actions has consequences that you like for yourself. I suspect that a lot of people implicitly run around the world like this. Toddlers are sort of in this mode. Many people don't get out of that toddler stage of moral development and sort of live in this narcissistic, quasi-sociopathic, it's just me, that's all I care about. Very few people defend this in public, because if you do, nobody's going to lend you money or be friends with you. You're a very dangerous person to everybody around you if this is your ethical structure. So very few explicit defenders of ethical egoism running around, at least in the philosophy world. So a more popular version is this one, utilitarianism. So this is, things are good if they're good for the most people. So what we're measuring now is not the consequences just for me. I'm measuring things in terms of their consequences for everybody. So something is good if there's different ways of measuring what counts as a good outcome, but for example, if you might think that happiness is the relevant measure. So whatever creates the most happiness for the most people is what counts as good under utilitarianism. This means you do have to, in some sense, quantify what counts as happiness or good outcomes. Not easy to do that, of course, because there's various types of happiness. There's sort of immediate sensory pleasure or long-term happiness. New parents, for example, often describe or like if you've got like a 3-year-old or something, they describe their moment-to-moment happiness as taking a deep plunge because they're sleep-deprived and run ragged and all that stuff, but they have a deep sense of, an enhanced sense of the meaningfulness of their lives. So one kind of happiness goes down when you become a parent, another kind goes up. Which type you want to measure, there's various different types of utilitarianism, but broadly the idea is something is good just to the extent that it brings about the most happiness. So you should study for the test because it's being prepared for tests makes you happier. And you are, of course, included in the calculus. Like, it's unlike ethical egoism, other people are included as well, but under utilitarianism, of course, you're trying to make yourself happy too. So you should study for the test because the reason to believe MP1 on a utilitarian or even an ethical egoist view is just being prepared for the test makes you happier, something like that. And that's what you, and then you have maybe even above P2, you have the theory of consequentialism. Yeah? So consequentialism says, or maybe, sorry, dependent with P2, you'd have consequentialism says that you should do things that make you happier. Preparing for tests will make you happier, therefore you should prepare for the test. Something like that. Yeah? Okay, so, you know, this is a fairly popular way of thinking about this stuff. It's nice because once you've figured out a way of measuring happiness, there are objective answers to what's good and bad. Like you can actually go around, so I think the country Bhutan has started to measure not gross national product, but gross national happiness. So they actually try to structure their social policies around generating maximum net happiness for people in the country, which is a nice idea, I think. Okay, so that's focused on the consequences of your actions. So that's the ethics of consequence. Let's do another. Let's do the ethics of duty, so sometimes called deontological ethics. Here, instead of the consequences of your actions, we're going to judge the intentions to act and whether they conform to your obligations, your duties, that kind of thing. So the oldest version of this, ethics of duty, is divine command theory. So, you know, God hands down some commandments and says, here's what you should or shouldn't do. Now, so for example, the 10 Commandments are all basically just trying to lay out, you know, what you're allowed to intend to do, right? Your intentions to act are the metric for whether you're doing well or not. So if you accidentally kill somebody, that's very different from the divine command theory than whether you on purpose kill somebody. So thou shalt not kill kind of translates better to thou shalt not murder. Murder is an intentional act. They're not saying like don't accident, like if some terrible accident happens and somebody dies, that's not violating the 10 Commandments. It's on purpose. So it's your intentions to act and whether they conform to various duties or not. So 10 Commandments, a set of duties, whether something is good or not depends crucially on whether you're following your duties. Immanuel Kant famously laid out another one. Sort of Kantian ethics are, he thought that you could derive just from careful rational reflection. So your duties to behave come from just thinking about what it is to be an agent. This is long. This is a hugely long, complicated story. I won't get too deep into it. But he says things like he thinks that he can prove that it's morally wrong to lie, regardless of the consequences of the lie. So, famously, his example is there's an axe murderer at your door. They want to axe murder your friend who's hiding in your basement, and they say, "Is your friend home?" And Kant says you're morally obligated to say yes, because it's wrong to lie, regardless of the consequences. his argument is long and complicated, but yeah.
Do you mind if I correct you
Please.
a little on that? I took moral and political, and Kant wouldn't say it's that you're morally, that you have to say yes, but rather that it would be wrong to say no.
Right.
You could stay silent, or you could say that you refuse to tell them.
Right. So
or
thank
say
you.
yes.
Thank you. So yes.
Say no.
Did I say you're morally obliged to say yes?
Yeah.
Okay, that was incorrect. Thank you. That was incorrect. You're morally obliged not to lie. So you're morally obliged not to lie to the person. That leaves open that you could tell the truth, and then once they go in, you like bean them on the back of the head or something like that. There's nothing that says you have to let them kill your friend, but the lying, Kant thought, regardless of the consequences. Thank you. That's a helpful correction. Yeah. So you could just say nothing also, but if you just stare, if they got an axe and they're like, "I'm ready to do a murder. Where's your friend?" Just staring at them blankly is probably not the best idea, but you could trick them. I mean, anyway. Okay, so the point is just to make the distinction between judging things in terms of their consequences or judging things in terms of your duties to behave in certain ways, duties to behave according to certain rules. So don't lie. Kant thinks that's so important that it doesn't matter what the consequences are. Whereas a utilitarian would say, well, what's the best outcome for everybody here? So you don't decide according to rules of behavior, duties to behave in certain ways. You just decide, what's the best way things could go for everybody? What makes most people the most happy? That's what you do. So if lying makes more people happy, go ahead and lie, according to the utilitarians. For Kant, so I'm sorry, now you got me thinking about the details of this. If I'm being very precise, there are two types of utilitarians. There are act utilitarians and rule utilitarians. So this is rule utilitarians say, act according to the rules that make most people happy most of the time, because they make most people happy. Act utilitarians say, just whatever, in any given acts, try to maximize happiness. Kant doesn't care at all whether the consequences are good or bad. He thinks it's just a matter of whether you're following your moral duties. Yeah?
Yeah, and the constant thing about lying is that it appears disguises your maxims. Basically, it hides what you're really trying to, like what your real motivations are, and that's what it's like.
So I took it that his reason, so the categorical imperative says you can't act according to a maxim that you can't rationally make universal. And if everybody lied all the time, then the practice of giving and asking for reasons would be undermined. So it's a kind of performative contradiction. You contradict the very axiom by which you act when you lie, something like that. If that didn't make sense, do not worry about it. This is deep cuts of Kant. Okay, so basically just if you get the difference between consequentialism and utilitarianism, so a different way of justifying value claims. So you're forced to choose between lying and telling the truth. You should not lie because you have a duty to tell the truth. Yeah? That's the kind of argument that a deontologist or an ethics of duty person would give. Yeah? Your duties determine your values. Yeah?
For your example about the axe murder, what do you do lie? What does that mean?
Well, so for Kant says our duties come out of the nature of rationality itself. So to be a rational agent is to try to be consistent, and lying is in some sense undermining your very rationality. So you violated one of your duties because you're not behaving in a way that a purely rational agent would do. Does that sound about right to the Kant literate people in the room? Yeah.
I think like when she says like what happens, like what does it do? Really, it doesn't like nothing actually happens. He's just saying that you're acting immorally.
Right.
So it's not like you're gonna die or someone's gonna like come kill you if you actually lie. It's just he's just saying that that's not the moral thing to do and that you shouldn't do it.
Essentially, yeah. Okay, so there's the ethics of duty. Kant does give us a nice distinction that's worth thinking about between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So an imperative is a statement like you should do this or you ought to do that, right? It's when you're telling people how to live their lives, as we all obviously enjoy doing, telling people what to do. So hypothetical imperative just says, if you want this to happen, then you should do this. So if you want to be a very effective supervillain, then you should invent a death ray, right? That's a very old-timey example, but if you want to be a highly effective serial killer, then you should no, right? So that's not saying it's good to be a serial killer or a supervillain. That's just saying if that's your goal, then here's how you should do it. So you can endorse all kinds of hypothetical imperatives without actually believing that doing the thing that they're talking about is a good idea. So if you want to cheat on a test, then you should do blank, blank, blank. And I could believe that that's true without actually thinking that you should cheat on your tests. Categorical imperatives are things that are just like, you should do this no matter what. So a really rough way of putting Kant's version of the categorical imperative is act in such a way that you're not making an exception of yourself. Or always treat people, including yourself, as an end in themselves rather than just a means. And what he's saying is those are not things that you're doing for the sake of getting something else. So actually this question about what happens when you violate this is pertinent here. He's not saying if you don't follow the categorical imperative, then something bad happens. He's just saying if you properly understand morality, here's what you should do. Yeah? It's not to reach some further end. Okay. Anyway, so I think that's a useful distinction to keep in mind. The difference between saying, if you want to bring about an outcome, you should do this, versus you should do this. And I think only the categorical one is properly normative, right? Because you don't necessarily endorse doing the thing in the hypothetical imperative. Anyway. Okay. One more thing we can maybe pick up from Kant, a nice moral rule to complement Hume's law. We'll call it Kant's law. He says, ought implies can. So if I say to somebody, you should do this, I'm implicitly saying this is within your ability to do. So the sphere of things that you ought to do, that you might be morally obliged to do, is entirely contained within the sphere of things that are possible for you to do. It's a nice sort of moral precept we get from Kant. I think most people agree with this. I think most people find this to be relatively plausible. If I say, you should flap your arms really hard and fly away, a reasonable response to that is, yeah, but I can't. So that's not a thing I should do because I can't. Anyway, okay, enough of Kant. Okay, so we did ethics of consequence. We judge actions by their outcomes. We did the ethics of duty. So we judge actions by whether they follow our duties or not. Here's another version of this, or another type of ethical theory, the ethics of virtue. So maybe the thing to do is judge actions in terms of what kind of person. So instead of actions, we're judging the character of people. We're saying, here's the kind of person you should try to become. What makes a person a good person or to have a good character. So in the ethics of virtue, here's a couple versions of the ethics of virtue. Of course, this is the Buddha. Buddhist philosophy is sometimes interpreted in this sense to say it's a set of beliefs about what a good character, what kind of character you should be cultivating. And the picture of what kind of character you should be cultivating, according to Buddhism, is you try to be as non-attached to material things as you can. So if anything is something that's not sort of anything contingent in your life, so like having comfortable clothes or not being cold or having enough food, all of those things can be taken away from you. So you shouldn't hang your happiness on any of them. You should be open to the idea that anything nice that you've got could go away. So it's an ethics of detachment. An ethics, the ideal character is a kind of person who doesn't depend for their happiness on anything outside of themselves, basically. Contrast that with another kind of ethics of virtue, Aristotle's thing. So Aristotle's got quite a different picture of the right kind of character, the kind of character that you want to have. So Aristotle says we've got these different sort of measures of virtue and vice, and your job is to kind of find the golden mean between these things. So, for example, don't be a coward, but also don't be reckless. So in Aristotle's day, they did a lot of war. They did a lot of city-states warring with each other. So a lot of the men had to go fight. And your job was, Aristotle thinks, you shouldn't be afraid of fighting such that you always run away, but don't be the reckless hooligan either. Don't like rush the enemy before all your friends get there. Find the right balance between recklessness and cowardice, which is bravery. Same thing with lying. So, don't be constantly lying, but you also don't have to tell your mom what you got up to this weekend in any detail. She probably doesn't want to know. She's probably happy you're not knowing. You don't want to overshare, right? And you might not want to know what your mom got up to this weekend. So, right? Sometimes you can tell too much. So there's an excess of truth-telling and there's a deficit of truth-telling, and you might want to be right in the middle there. Similarly, he says there's the correct amount of parties to throw. So given your circumstances, so this is all within a context, right? So given how much money you have and how your life is going and all that, you should throw the right amount of parties with the right amount of food and the right amount of wine. You don't want to do it every night. You don't want to like go wild and bankrupt yourself, but also you don't want to throw no parties. You want to throw some parties, welcome your friends, feed them, give them booze, bring somebody with one of those lyre things, play some music, whatever. So there's a correct number of parties to throw for Aristotle. Contrast that with the Buddha, for whom the correct number of parties is 0. That's no parties, no wine, no dancing, like just no partying whatsoever. That's the correct character to be cultivating. So I hope it's clear. There's very different kind of characters being held up as the right kind of character to cultivate, but they're both focusing on what kind of person you want to end up as. Yeah?
In NP party for pleasure, and pleasure is bliss, Buddha's theory was not to go through that means of party to get to bliss. He directly connected to the bliss. So
right.
Buddha was always partying to say.
Yeah, in some very broad sense in the sense of sitting quietly under a tree by yourself, he was always partying. It's not much of a party, but so you're right to say the Buddha's not anti-pleasure. He's against taking pleasure, finding your pleasure in things that are outside of yourself. So it's perfectly okay to take pleasure in your own breath, for example, because if you're not breathing, you're not alive. So in cultivating meditation, you learn to deeply enjoy just the act of breathing, and that's fine. It's supposed to be enraptured with the bliss of breathing, but not, for example, eating delicious food or hanging out with your friends or any of that stuff. No.
Here I would like to mention that you limited meditation to just breathing, because
I did not, no.
you said it's all about breathing.
I did not say that, no.
You said,
No, I said he says you should take pleasure in things like breathing. That's not exclusive.
yeah, that's true, but after a point you can just, because when you eat something, that's your reaction to what you're eating. You can just, in your mind, you can create that same reaction if you want. You do not need to be dependent on somebody else. Like if you get angry, that's you reacting to something outside. You can make like in your head.
Okay, I feel we're drifting off topic here. Okay. So, here's an argument that Aristotle would make. You haven't thrown a party in a while. You should be moderate in your virtues. You should throw parties once in a while. So moderation of the virtues, justified by his broader ethical theory, is why you should occasionally throw parties, which justifies you should throw a party. Yeah? Not because of the outcomes and not because of your duties, but because of the kind of person you're trying to become. Yeah? So that's the sort of focus of ethics for Aristotle and the Buddha, the character that you're cultivating. Okay, one last one, the ethics of care. So this doesn't focus on the consequences of actions or duties or even your character. It says that the primary ethical object is your relationships to other people. So it focuses on relations, fundamentally. So this is Confucius. Confucius has got an ethics of care. So he describes his ethical theory describes the kind of main social relationships, and his belief is if you get those main social relationships in their proper order, then you're living an ethical life. That's the correct way of living. So he's got ruler to ruled. So the ruler has ethical obligations to the people he's ruling, and the people being ruled have ethical obligations to the ruler. Father to son, husband to wife, elder to brother, friend to friend. Those are, for him, the main ethical obligations. You'll notice they are male-centered. He certainly was a fan of the male-dominated society. So these are reciprocal relationships. Each person has an obligation to the other. So the father has an ethical obligation to his son, the son to his father. But the main difference here between this and the other ethical theories we've talked about so far is the emphasis on relationship as more important than other factors. So contrast this with consequentialism and utilitarianism specifically. In utilitarianism, most happiness for the most people. So if there's two people drowning in a stream here and my brother drowning in a stream over here, the utilitarians say I should go save those two people and let my brother drown. I'm not going to do that personally. I way prioritize my close familial relationships over more distant social relationships. So like the closer somebody is to me in terms of family or friends or other sort of close social ties, the more time and energy I'm going to spend trying to help them and all that kind of thing. Yeah. So, and I don't think that's actually profoundly unethical. I think that it's not a type of hypocrisy in my opinion. This actually makes perfect sense if you're thinking about things through the lens of the ethics of care. So, I don't love the specific way Confucius sets it up. So I don't think that these are the main or only ethical obligations. So, for example, he leaves out like obligations between the wife and the children. That's not one of the main. And also the woman is just identified as wife rather than individual person with their own point of view. So here's another version of this. This kind of gets reinvented in the 20th century by feminist philosophers, the feminist ethics of care. So this was developed specifically to kind of resist the abstract ethical theorizing, which was dominant at the time in philosophy, and says things like, your primary ethical responsibilities are determined by your primary social relationships. Now, this is construed much more broadly than Confucius did. So Carol Gillian is an example here. She certainly doesn't say the nuclear family is the primary social organization and it has to be that. She doesn't gender it, so it's not like it has to be husband to wife or anything like that. It's just however close your social relation is, that's the degree of your ethical responsibility. And ethics entirely plays out on this way of thinking in terms of fulfilling those social relationships in a way that's sort of conducive to everybody's flourishing. So being in these, you respond to the specific social and emotional relationship you're in rather than some kind of abstract rule that's supposed to cover all situations. Yeah? So there you go, ethics of care. So here's a kind of argument that somebody in the ethics of care would make. I think this would work for either feminist ethics of care or Confucianism. So your parent is ill. You have a responsibility to your family. Sorry, I got the numbers wrong here. Yeah. Therefore, you should take care of your parents when you're ill. Therefore, you should take care of your parent. Something like that. Yeah. So the justification for the value claim is precisely that you've got these social relationships. Okay. So there you go. There's a very, very broad survey of ethical theories. Any one of the people. So I think most people don't have a very explicit ethical theory that they think is the one and only correct one. I find myself drifting around between them. So I sometimes justify things in terms of their consequences, and sometimes in terms of my relationships, and sometimes in terms of virtues and outcomes and all that kind of stuff. philosophers love putting people in situations where they have to choose between them. So we like to take these various ethical frameworks and make them fight. So like put them in a bottle and shake it up and see what happens. So here's just a couple of examples of that kind of thing, where we're trying to pit people's intuitions for one or the other against each other. So outcomes versus consequences. That shouldn't be outcomes versus consequences. It should be outcomes versus duties. That's the same thing twice. Okay, there's an error on my slide. Okay. I'm gonna fix it right now. Outcomes versus duties. Great. There we go. Okay, so here's a scenario. A person is admitted to a hospital in a coma. There happen to be five others who will die without organ transplants, and none are available. The doctor is certain that they could make the family of the person in the coma believe that they died of natural causes, and while they're stable, it's uncertain that they can be revived. Should the doctor secretly kill the person to save 5 others? So, one person dying versus 5 people dying, I think the consequences are hard to argue. Suppose those 5 people all had families that would miss them just as much as that one person. Do you agree that the consequences of doing this are better than not doing it? Sort of? Yeah.
I guess it depends on the ethical theory.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to get. So a consequentialist would say, a pure consequentialist would say, yeah, that's got the best outcome, that's the best. But you might want to say something like, yeah, but doctors shouldn't be doing that. Right? You might want to say like, no. You have a duty to not kill people under your care. I don't care how convenient it is for you. That's not what's at issue here. There's a rule that says you don't do that. So we're putting rules in tension with outcomes. If you like Star Trek at all, this is one of the lots of their episodes sort of like put the, oh, we can't break the Prime Directive, but I really want to. Yeah.
Why don't the doctors go to the family and let them decide?
You're not allowed to adjust the scenario. You gotta go within this scenario. Yeah. Do you know what? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that the consequentialists would say, yeah, do it.
Yeah.
Utilitarianism and Kant would say no.
Really? Oh, sorry, deontology for Kant. Deontology and Kant. Yeah, Kant would say no because you've got a duty to not kill people just because you find it convenient. Right? And I think that's a pretty good rule. I like that rule. I have a strong attraction to the rule, don't kill people just because it makes your workflow work better. Yeah.
In like a situation like this, what perspective do you think would be like proper to take on? Like, would you want to take on the Kantian perspective where you're talking about like using them as like a means versus the end, or are you looking at like utilitarianism where you want to look at the most? Like, someone has to make a decision.
It's a real good question, and I do not have a good answer. I do not know. I don't know what the answer is. Oh, sorry, I saw another hand up here.
Oh, I just wanted to point out that it says you would have to make the family believe that they died of natural causes.
Yeah.
Which is lying, so Kant would say no.
Kant would definitely say no. Yeah. So there's lies involved here. There's deception, a little bit of murder. Yeah.
Betrayal of trust.
Sorry?
Betrayal of trust.
Yeah, there's also that. I mean, that is involved in also that's implicit in I think lying and murdering is betrayal of trust.
And how would the 5 people who lived feel one person died for them?
Oh, you don't tell them. You don't tell them. Look, if you're a doctor murderer, you keep your files closed, right? Okay, so consider what you think about this example. Now consider another example, another classic philosophy example. I love the groan. Oh, God, okay, here we go. So a trolley's rolling down a track towards 5 people. You're standing by a switch that could cause it to hit only one person. You cannot stop the trolley. Do you flip the switch?
Depends. Who is dying?
You don't know that. You don't know any of them. Total strangers. Yeah.
So, like, utilitarianism would say, obviously, flip the
Obviously.
switch
Right.
right away.
Right.
But, like, I guess, like, divine command theory maybe could say no.
Divine command theory might.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So if you're flipping the switch, you're killing the person, though, right?
Right.
If you do nothing, you're technically not killing anybody.
Right.
Because it was going to happen regardless.
Right. It's the same, and note, that's right. Notice it's the same situation as the doctor thing. The doctor thing, my intuitions scream at me that this doctor should not be doing this. I don't know about you. That's my intuitions immediately say, no, 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 no. No doctor murderer, I don't care. Here, I'm like, yeah, but maybe I should flip the switch. But it's the same, I mean, there are some subtle differences, but it's basically the same problem. Yeah?
Do you think that people's like opinions change based on like virtue ethics and the virtues that you associate with like a doctor and stuff instead of just like, you or this random person? Like a lot of times the virtues associated with a doctor and like the powers they have and stuff like that are like different than the values you hold of yourself, and like they're held to a higher standard. So do you think that like that view of difference, like the virtue ethics would be the reason why this
Interesting.
is differently?
Those are, yeah, that's very interesting. So like the role of a doctor, so the role that they play, and that also might do something about ethics of care. So the social role that the doctor occupies makes a difference or something like that. Yeah, yeah. People's actual ethical intuition, there's a really interesting psych literature about how people's ethical intuitions play out. It partly depends on like how fast you make them answer. So if you make them answer quickly, they make a different decision than if you give them a minute with it. Yeah?
I think there is another big difference between the trolley and the doctor example. In
Yeah.
the doctor example, it explicitly says there is a chance that the coma patient might die anyway, even if you don't actively choose to murder the patient. Meanwhile, in this case, it seems to be pretty clear that the only way that one guy tied is going to die is if you pull the switch.
But that makes it, that's right, that is a difference. But that makes it, my intuitions still go the opposite direction. So it's worse for the doctor than this person. But for the doctor, that person might have just spontaneously died anyway. So that's like, if you pull the switch, maybe the person on the one track is going to die anyway. In this case, if you pull the switch, they're definitely going to, so if you pull the switch, they're definitely going to die. If you don't pull the switch, they'll be fine. So imagine this one person on the track by themselves is in the coma. They might die anyway. So I think that makes it more justified for the doctor to do their secret weird murder thing. So it's still, I mean, you're right that that's a difference, but it's a difference that goes in the opposite direction than my intuitions anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, doesn't the doctor owe like a duty of care to the patient to not kill them, right? But you don't owe any duty of care to that one guy there.
So good. Yeah, that might be a source of the difference in my intuitions. People who advocate for not flipping the switch say you have a duty to not take actions which result in people dying. That's the kind of, they do a version of this where you say, don't perform any action that you can clearly see will result in somebody's death. But yeah. So this one's very weird and abstract. They are trying to figure out a solution to it for the self-driving cars that are promised to be coming soon, because they got to figure something out. There's going to be situations that are analogous to this. The self-driving cars will have to decide who they're going to run over or not, which is a little disturbing, but yeah. Okay, so this is philosophers. I mean, in most cases, I think most of these ethical frameworks mostly agree on how you should behave. In a lot of cases, I think it makes sense to sort of shift between them depending on what's the most important. This is philosophers, again, putting these theories in a bottle and shaking it up and making them fight. So these are the cases that are supposed to drive a wedge between these. Okay. Yeah. What would I do? I mean, I have inconsistent intuitions. I think I would say no to doctor murder, but yes to flipping the switch. And I don't think I don't think my opinions really matter much, but that's just since you asked. Yeah.
Just wondering, for the first example, would it change at all if instead of the doctor making the decision, it was you yourself? Like, would you?
So me as a philosophy prof, I'm like, I don't want to do any murder. Like, I don't want to do any murder. I gotta say, it's still unappealing. I'm glad I don't have to choose. Let's say I'm going to construct my life such that I don't have to make these type of decisions. Sorry, yeah.
Choose not to answer these because, like, the doctor knows who is dying, who's not. He knows his patients.
Don't try to worm out of it. You got to face up to the dilemma.
And the other guy knows the reaction of people. Somebody has accepted death and they're in peace, and the other guy says, save me, I want to live. Then
So context would fill in a lot of it. Yeah, so for the question, I think that's, so for the actual ethical decisions, you make them in a context, which probably tells you a lot about how you should decide. So we don't make abstract choices like this. What we make are specific, concrete, in some situation choices. And that probably does a lot of the work for us. Okay. Okay, so that was a whole bunch of stuff about ethical theories, telling you how to value, which values tell you what goals to set, goals tell you how to behave. So just to bring this back to the point of this class, in your argument analyses, I do want to see the level of values. So these value judgments play a really significant role in a lot of the arguments we'll be dealing with. If they're not there, if there's a normative conclusion and there's no normative premises, I do want you to add them in. You don't have to worry about the level of ethical theories, however. So for the rest of the course, we're not going to worry too much about the level of justifying values claims, unless in your argument analysis you find a values claim that you think is wildly unjustified. But we are going to be concerned with the values level of that analysis. Okay? Okay, that's it for now. And next week we'll talk about clarifying meaning. Sorry, on Wednesday we'll do exercises, so come for that.